The crystal champagne flute shattered against Italian marble like a gunshot, sending $600 of Dom Perignon cascading toward handmade Louboutin heels. Serena Washington froze mid-step, her dark fingers still gripping the silver tray, as 400 pairs of elite Boston eyes turned toward the help who dared disrupt their charity gala. "I'll marry you if you dance this tango." William Montgomery IV's cruel laughter cut through the Ritz-Carlton ballroom like a blade. Gasps rippled through the crowd as society matrons clutched their pearls. Mrs. Eleanor Whitman's wrinkled hand flew to her throat, guilt flashing across her face. Her carelessly placed walking cane had caused the accident she'd never confessed to. Serena's trembling fingers found the small hospital bracelet hidden beneath her black uniform sleeve, Marcus Jr.'s name still legible after 2 years. The same hands that once graced Lincoln Center's stage now knelt on cold marble, picking up glass shards while Boston's wealthiest watched her humiliation. But as Por una Cabeza began to play, something shifted in her dark eyes, a spark of defiance that would shatter more than champagne glasses. What had this grieving mother sacrificed to survive? And what would her dead son's legacy unleash in this gilded tomb of privilege? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The Ritz-Carlton's Grand Ballroom had witnessed countless charity galas, but none quite like the Boston Children's Heart Foundation's annual fundraiser. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables adorned with white orchids, while Boston's elite sipped champagne that cost more than most families' monthly rent. The evening's goal was ambitious, raising $5 million for pediatric cardiac care, a cause that touched many hearts in the room. Serena Washington moved through the crowd like a shadow, her black uniform rendering her nearly invisible among the sea of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. At 42, she carried herself with quiet dignity despite the exhaustion etched in the lines around her dark eyes. 3 jobs kept her afloat, barely. The hotel catering gig paid the best, $22 an hour plus tips, but it came with a price. Watching people spend on a single bottle of wine what she earned in a week. Her calloused hands, once graceful enough to command standing ovations at Lincoln Center, now gripped serving trays with practiced efficiency. Those same hands had held her dying son Marcus Jr. just 2 years ago, stroking his forehead as machines kept him alive long enough to save another child's life. The memory never left her, especially not here, surrounded by the very people whose children benefited from organs like her boy's generous heart. William Montgomery IV held court near the auction display, his presence commanding attention without effort. At 48, he embodied old Boston money, 6 feet 2 inches of privilege wrapped in a custom Armani tuxedo. His steel-gray eyes surveyed the room like a general reviewing troops, calculating net worth and social standing with practiced ease. To him, the help were simply part of the scenery, as unremarkable as the marble columns or gilt-framed paintings. His daughter Emma, 16 and radiant in a pale blue gown, stood nearby but seemed worlds away from her father's social machinations. Since her heart transplant 2 years ago, she'd grown increasingly sensitive to suffering around her, much to her father's bewilderment. Tonight, something felt different. Her new heart beat faster than usual, as if responding to an invisible rhythm. Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, the evening's octogenarian organizer, navigated the crowd with her pearl-handled walking cane, greeting donors and ensuring every detail met her exacting standards. At 78, she'd raised over $50 million for various causes, earning respect even from those who privately questioned her sharp tongue and sharper judgments. The evening's entertainment, a professional tango performance by renowned dancers from Argentina, awaited its cue. The musicians had already taken their places, instruments gleaming under the lights. But fate had other plans for who would dance that night, and which hearts would be forever changed by the rhythm of Por una Cabeza. The evening had been proceeding flawlessly until 8:47 p.m. when Serena Washington's life changed forever with a single misstep. She'd been carrying a tray of 6 crystal champagne flutes, each filled with Dom Perignon 2010, vintage champagne worth more than her monthly rent. The glasses clinked softly as she navigated between the round tables draped in ivory silk, their surfaces adorned with towering arrangements of white roses and baby's breath. Mrs. Eleanor Whitman had been deep in conversation with Judge Patricia Hamilton about the evening's silent auction when she absently shifted her pearl-handled walking cane. The polished mahogany struck the marble floor with a sharp tap, then rolled slightly into the narrow aisle where servers moved with practiced precision. Serena, focused on reaching table 12 where William Montgomery held court with potential investors, never saw the obstacle that would destroy her carefully constructed invisibility. Her right foot caught the cane's curved handle. Time seemed to slow as she felt herself falling forward, the tray tilting at a dangerous angle. $600 worth of champagne transformed into golden projectiles, arcing through the air before gravity claimed them. The crystal flutes struck the Italian Carrara marble with sounds like gunshots, crack, 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 each impact echoing through the suddenly silent ballroom. The champagne spread in rivulets across the pristine floor, creating a lake of gold that reflected the chandelier's light. Droplets splattered onto evening gowns and patent leather shoes, drawing gasps and small shrieks from nearby guests. Mrs. Clarissa Thornton jumped backward, her Hermes clutch pressed to her chest, while Senator Robert Hayes stared down at his champagne-stained bow tie with undisguised horror. Serena hit her knees hard, the impact shooting pain up her legs, but her first instinct was to minimize the damage. Her hands flew to the largest glass shards, desperately trying to contain the mess that now commanded the attention of 400 of Boston's most influential residents. The serving tray clattered beside her, its silver surface scratched and dented from the fall. "Dear God in heaven," gasped Mrs. Adelaide Morrison, her jeweled hand fluttering to her throat. "Someone call maintenance immediately." But it was William Montgomery's voice that cut through the murmurs, like a blade through silk. He rose from his chair with the fluid motion of a predator, his steel-gray eyes blazing with a fury that seemed disproportionate to the accident. His face had darkened to an alarming shade of red, veins visible at his temples as he surveyed the destruction. "Incompetent!" The word exploded from his lips, reverberating off the vaulted ceiling. 3 years I've watched this carnival of clumsiness, and still you people can't perform the simplest tasks without destroying property worth more than your annual salary. The crowd's collective intake of breath was audible. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, while others leaned forward with the morbid fascination of witnessing a public execution. Mrs. Whitman's face had gone pale as parchment, her lips pressed into a thin line as guilt carved deeper lines into her weathered features. She gripped her walking cane, the very instrument of Serena's downfall, with white-knuckled fingers, but remained silent. Serena's cheeks burned with humiliation as she continued gathering glass fragments, each piece cutting into her dignity as sharply as they threatened to slice her trembling fingers. Her uniform, a simple black dress with white collar and cuffs, was now stained with champagne and speckled with tiny crystal shards that caught the light like tears. "Mr. Montgomery," ventured Dr. James Morrison, the evening's guest of honor, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to diffusing tense situations. "Perhaps we should..." "Should what?" William whirled on the distinguished cardiologist, his voice rising another octave. "Pretend this level of incompetence is acceptable. Make excuses for people who clearly lack the basic coordination to walk across a room without causing thousands of dollars in damage." Emma Montgomery appeared in the ballroom's archway, drawn by her father's raised voice. At 16, she possessed an ethereal beauty that seemed almost otherworldly since her transplant. Pale skin with an inner luminescence, dark hair that fell in gentle waves past her shoulders, and eyes that held depths of compassion her father had never understood. She took in the scene with growing distress, her father's rage, the woman on her knees, the uncomfortable crowd. "Daddy?" Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried across the suddenly silent room. "What's happening?" William's anger found fresh fuel. "What's happening, sweetheart, is a perfect demonstration of why certain people belong in certain positions. This woman—" He gestured dismissively at Serena, still kneeling among the wreckage, "has just proven beyond doubt that some individuals simply lack the capacity for civilized behavior." The orchestra leader, sensing the need for intervention, raised his baton. The opening notes of Por una cabeza began to drift across the ballroom, a haunting melody that seemed to mock the tension crackling through the air like electricity before a storm. The tango music swelled through the ballroom like liquid silk, each note of Por una cabeza seeming to mock the tension that crackled between William Montgomery and the kneeling woman at his feet. But something had shifted in the air, a dangerous electricity that made seasoned socialites lean forward in their chairs, sensing that they were about to witness something unprecedented. William's chest puffed with the arrogance of a man who had never been challenged by someone he considered beneath his notice. The champagne had stained his Italian leather shoes, a minor inconvenience that he'd transformed into a public crucifixion. His voice carried across the marble expanse with the authority of generations of privilege. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his arms spread wide like a ringmaster commanding center stage, "since we're all here to support the arts, perhaps our clumsy server would like to demonstrate her cultural refinement. This beautiful tango, surely someone of her background, has some natural rhythm?" The cruel laughter that rippled through sections of the crowd made Emma Montgomery's heart constrict painfully in her chest. She pressed a hand to her sternum, feeling the rapid, irregular beating that had plagued her since the music began. Dr. Morrison, standing near the orchestra pit, noticed her distress and took a step forward, his trained eye catching the subtle signs of cardiac irregularity. "Daddy, please stop," Emma whispered, but her words were lost in the rising murmur of uncomfortable conversation. Some guests began reaching for their phones, sensing a viral moment in the making. Others, led by Mrs. Whitman's frozen expression of horror, seemed to recognize that they were witnessing something that would haunt them long after the evening ended. William's voice rose above the gentle tango melody, each word dripping with disdain. "I have a proposition that should entertain us all. If this woman can dance this tango, truly dance it, not some improvised shuffling, I'll marry her right here, tonight, in front of all these witnesses." The ballroom erupted. Gasps, nervous laughter, and scandalized whispers created a cacophony that temporarily drowned out the orchestra. Senator Hayes choked on his replacement champagne, while Mrs. Thornton fanned herself with her auction paddle as if suddenly overcome by the heat. "William!" Mrs. Whitman's voice cracked like a whip. "That's quite enough." But William was intoxicated by the attention, by the power he wielded over the room's emotions. "Think of the headlines," he continued, his smile sharp as broken glass. "Boston billionaire marries the help. It would certainly make the front page of the Globe." Serena remained on her knees, her hands bleeding from tiny cuts as she gathered the last fragments of crystal. But something was happening inside her, a transformation that began in the depths of her grief-scarred heart and spread outward like fire through dry kindling. The music seemed to be calling to her, awakening memories of a life before tragedy stripped away everything she'd ever loved. Her fingers found the small hospital bracelet hidden beneath her uniform sleeve, a thin band of white plastic that bore her son's name. and the date that had divided her life into before and after. Marcus Jr., Washington, organ donor. The words were faded but still legible, a testament to the boy who had taught her that dignity couldn't be stolen, only surrendered. "Mr. Montgomery," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but somehow carrying across the vast space. The room fell silent with such abruptness that the orchestra faltered, musicians glancing uncertainly at their conductor. Serena rose to her feet with the fluid grace that had once commanded standing ovations at Lincoln Center. Blood dotted her palms, but she ignored the sting as she faced the man who had tried to reduce her to nothing more than a cautionary tale about knowing one's place. "I accept your challenge," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "But when I dance this tango, when I show these people what you refuse to see, you'll honor your promise in front of all these witnesses." The silence stretched taut as a violin string. William's face had gone pale beneath his perfectly groomed silver hair, the reality of his words suddenly crashing down upon him. He had expected cowering tears, perhaps a dramatic flight from the room. He had never anticipated that his victim might possess the audacity to call his bluff. Emma's heart was racing now, each beat echoing in her ears like thunder. She found herself moving toward the center of the ballroom without conscious thought, drawn by something she couldn't name. "Doctor." Morrison followed, his medical instincts overriding social protocol as he monitored his young patient's unusual response to the unfolding drama. "Serena," Mrs. Whitman said, her voice thick with emotion, "you don't have to do this." William spoke in anger. "No one expects—" "But I do expect it," Serena interrupted, her dark eyes never leaving William's face. "A man of his stature surely stands behind his word. Unless, of course, he's the kind of person who makes promises he has no intention of keeping." The challenge hung in the air like incense, heavy and inescapable. William found himself trapped by his own arrogance, his public persona, and the scrutiny of 400 pairs of eyes that would remember every word, every gesture, every moment of cowardice if he tried to retreat. Judge Hamilton leaned forward in her chair, her legal mind already cataloging the binding nature of a promise made before so many witnesses. "William," she said quietly, "perhaps it's time to think carefully about your next words." But Serena was already moving, her hands reaching down to remove the practical black shoes that had carried her through countless shifts, serving people who never bothered to learn her name. Her bare feet touched the cold marble, and something electric seemed to pass through her body, a connection to the music, to memories of a time when she had been someone else entirely. The orchestra conductor, sensing the dramatic moment, raised his baton. The opening strains of Por una cabeza began again, each note hanging in the air like a question waiting to be answered. Emma pressed both hands to her chest now, her breathing shallow and rapid as something inexplicable surged through her transplanted heart. "Emma?" Dr. Morrison moved closer to his patient, concern evident in his voice. "How are you feeling?" "Like I'm about to watch something miraculous," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the woman who stood poised at the edge of transformation. "Like everything is about to change." And in that moment, as Serena Washington prepared to reclaim a piece of her stolen dignity, the entire ballroom held its breath, sensing that they were about to witness something that would haunt their memories long after the last note faded into silence. The first step transformed everything. Serena's bare foot touched the marble floor with the precision of a prayer, her body remembering what her mind had tried to forget. The posture came first, shoulders squared but relaxed, spine elongated, chin lifted not in defiance but in the quiet confidence of someone who had once commanded stages across 2 continents. The 400 guests fell into absolute silence, even the soft clinking of jewelry and whispered conversations dying away as they witnessed the metamorphosis of a woman they had dismissed as invisible. William Montgomery stood frozen, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, confusion, and dawning horror. This was not the stumbling humiliation he had orchestrated. The woman before him moved with a fluidity that spoke of years of training, of muscle memory that poverty and tragedy could not erase. His trap had become a stage, and he was no longer the director of this performance. The tango's opening notes seemed to flow directly into Serena's bloodstream. Her arms rose with impossible grace, one extended toward an invisible partner, while the other curved at her waist. Her head tilted with the haughty elegance that made the tango the most passionate of all ballroom dances, and suddenly the shabby uniform could not diminish the regal bearing that radiated from her very bones. Emma's heart was hammering now, each beat reverberating through her chest with such intensity that Dr. Morrison moved closer, his hand discreetly checking her pulse. But the girl seemed transfixed, her dark eyes wide with wonder as she watched Serena begin to move across the marble floor with steps that belonged in the world's finest ballrooms. "Dear Lord," whispered Mrs. Adelaide Morrison, her champagne glass trembling in her jeweled fingers. "She actually knows how to dance." The murmur that rippled through the crowd carried notes of amazement, embarrassment, and growing shame. Senator Hayes loosened his bow tie, suddenly finding the ballroom stifling as he realized he had just witnessed a profound misjudgment of character. Judge Hamilton leaned forward in her chair, her legal mind cataloging the implications of William's promise, while her human heart recognized the artistry unfolding before them. Serena moved into a series of walking steps, the caminada, that required perfect balance and timing. Her bare feet glided across the floor with the whisper-soft precision of a master, each step placed with mathematical accuracy while maintaining the sensual flow that made the tango simultaneously refined and raw. She was dancing alone, but her body movements suggested an invisible partner of equal skill, someone who understood the intricate conversation between lead and follow that made the dance so mesmerizing. The memories crashed over her in waves as her body found its rhythm. Lincoln Center, 1998. The spotlight hot on her face as she and Marcus, not her son, but her first dance partner and husband, moved across the stage in perfect synchronization. The standing ovation that had lasted 4 minutes. The critic from the New York Times who had written that Serena Washington possessed a quality of movement that transforms technique into poetry. But even as those golden memories surfaced, it was her son's voice that guided her steps. Marcus Jr. had been 8 years old when he first saw her dance professionally, his eyes wide with pride as his mama commanded a stage full of grown-ups. "You're like a queen, Mama," he had whispered afterward. "When you dance, you're the most beautiful queen in the whole world." A sob tried to escape her throat, but she channeled the emotion into her movement, letting grief become grace. Her arms swept through the air in a molinetti, a turning step that required perfect control and balance. The crowd gasped as she executed it flawlessly, her body telling a story of love and loss that needed no words. William's face had gone ashen. The woman he had tried to humiliate was revealing herself to be a master of one of the world's most demanding art forms. His eyes darted around the ballroom, catching the expressions of his peers, some watching with growing admiration, others with the uncomfortable realization that they had participated in the public degradation of someone whose talent far exceeded their own cultural sophistication. "How is this possible?" he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, her guilt over causing the original accident now compounded by shame at her silence during William's attack, found her voice. "Perhaps, William," she said loud enough for nearby tables to hear, "you should have asked about her background before making assumptions." Emma had moved closer to the dancing area, Dr. Morrison staying protectively at her side. The girl's face was luminous with emotion, tears streaming down her cheeks as she watched Serena perform a series of ganchos, leg hooks that required extraordinary flexibility and control. Something about the woman's grace, her ability to transform pain into beauty, resonated in the deepest chambers of Emma's transplanted heart. "Dr. Morrison," Emma whispered, her hand pressed to her chest. "Do you feel it? The music. It's like it's coming from inside me." The cardiologist frowned, noting the rapid but steady rhythm of her pulse. Emma's reaction was unusual but not medically alarming. What concerned him more was the intensity of her emotional response, the way she seemed to be experiencing the performance on a cellular level that he couldn't quite explain. Serena was building toward the dance's climax now, her movements growing more complex and emotionally charged. She executed a series of bolios, whipping leg movements that required perfect timing and balance, with the precision of someone who had performed them thousands of times. The tango was telling the story of every woman who had loved and lost, who had been dismissed and underestimated, who had found the strength to rise again despite the weight of the world pressing down upon her shoulders. The ballroom had become a cathedral, the silence so complete that every footfall, every whisper of fabric against skin, every intake of breath was audible. Even the waitstaff had stopped their duties to witness what was unfolding. This was no longer a charity gala entertainment. This was a revelation, a moment when the artificial barriers between servant and served were stripped away to reveal the common humanity underneath. Judge Hamilton found herself thinking of her own assumptions, the time she had looked past service workers without seeing them as complete human beings with their own stories, talents, and dreams. The woman dancing before them had just shattered every comfortable prejudice about class and worth, with nothing more than the movement of her body through space. As the music built toward its crescendo, Serena's dance became a prayer, a memorial, and a declaration all at once. Her arms reached toward the ceiling as if trying to touch heaven itself. Her face tilted upward with an expression of such profound longing that several guests found themselves weeping without understanding why. William stood paralyzed, watching his worldview crumble with each perfectly executed step. The woman he had dismissed as incompetent was revealing herself to be an artist of extraordinary caliber. The racial assumptions he had never consciously acknowledged were being demolished by the undeniable evidence of her mastery. His promise, made in cruel jest, was becoming a binding contract witnessed by 400 of Boston's most influential citizens. Mrs. Whitman's walking cane trembled in her arthritic hands as she watched Serena perform a final series of turns that would have challenged dancers half her age. The old woman's mind was racing, calculating social ramifications and personal responsibilities. She was the one who had caused the accident that led to this confrontation, and now she had the power to either support William's attempt to escape his promise or hold him accountable to his word. Emma's heart was beating so rapidly now that Dr. Morrison considered calling for his medical bag. But the girl showed no signs of distress beyond the emotional impact of watching something beautiful and heartbreaking unfold before her eyes. If anything, she seemed more alive, more present than she had been in months. The music began its final descent, and Serena prepared for the closing that would seal her performance. And William's fate. Her body coiled like a spring, gathering energy for the dramatic finale that would leave no doubt about her qualifications as a dancer. But more than that, her movements carried the weight of every injustice she had endured, every moment of being looked through rather than seen, every day of scrubbing floors and serving people who considered her beneath their notice. As she prepared for her final bow, one thought echoed through her mind with crystal clarity. Marcus Jr. had died believing that people could change, that love was stronger than hate, and that dignity could never be truly taken from someone who refused to surrender it. Tonight, in this marble cathedral of privilege, she would find out if her son's faith in humanity had been justified. The last note hung in the air like a benediction, and Serena Washington stood in the center of the ballroom, chest heaving, eyes blazing with the fire of someone who had just reclaimed her power in front of 400 witnesses who would never again be able to pretend they hadn't seen her true worth. The silence that followed the final note of Por una cabeza stretched across the ballroom like a held breath. 400 guests sat frozen in their chairs, champagne glasses suspended halfway to lips, conversations dying mid-sentence as they processed what they had just witnessed. The transformation had been so complete, so utterly unexpected, that several people wondered if they were experiencing some elaborate performance art piece rather than the spontaneous humiliation of a hotel worker. Serena Washington stood in the center of the marble floor, her chest rising and falling from the exertion, but her posture remained erect and dignified. Perspiration dotted her dark skin, catching the chandelier light like diamonds, but her eyes blazed with a fire that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. She had just performed at a level that would have earned standing ovations in Buenos Aires, New York, or any of the world's premier dance venues. The first sound to break the silence was the soft thud of Senator Hayes setting down his champagne glass with trembling fingers. The distinguished politician who had served 3 terms in Congress and thought he had seen everything found himself completely unprepared for the emotional impact of watching someone reclaim their dignity with such devastating grace. "My God," whispered Mrs. Adelaide Morrison, her voice barely audible. "She's a professional." The murmur that began at her table rippled outward like stones cast into still water. "Professional" became the word whispered from guest to guest, each repetition carrying more weight, more implication about what William Montgomery's cruel jest had actually accomplished. He had not exposed incompetence. He had revealed mastery that put most of them to shame. Emma Montgomery moved forward as if drawn by invisible threads, her hands still pressed to her chest where her heart continued its rapid, irregular rhythm. Dr. Morrison stayed close, his trained eye monitoring her condition, but even he found himself distracted by the profound artistry they had just witnessed. The girl's face was streaked with tears, her dark eyes wide with something approaching awe. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," Emma said, her young voice carrying clearly across the hushed ballroom. "Daddy, how could you not know? How could you not see?" William Montgomery stood as still as the marble statues adorning the ballroom's corners, his face cycling through a spectrum of emotions that his privileged upbringing had never prepared him to navigate. The woman before him, the woman he had tried to humiliate, to reduce to a cautionary tale about knowing one's place, had just demonstrated a level of artistic sophistication that exceeded anything in his own cultural experience. His mind raced backward through every interaction he had ever had with Serena Washington. 3 years of charity galas, corporate events, and private parties where she had moved through his world like a shadow, serving drinks and clearing tables while he and his peers discussed art, culture, and refinement. How many times had he pontificated about the importance of supporting the arts while true artistry stood invisible at his elbow? Mrs. Eleanor Whitman rose from her chair with the aid of her pearl-handled walking cane, the very instrument that had set this entire confrontation in motion. At 78, she had witnessed enough of life's ironies to recognize a profound one when it unfolded before her eyes. The guilt that had been gnawing at her since the champagne glasses shattered now transformed into something sharper, more urgent. "William," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had navigated Boston society for more than half a century, "I believe you made a promise." The words hit the assembled guests like a physical force. 400 pairs of eyes turned toward William Montgomery, waiting to see what kind of man he truly was when stripped of his assumptions and forced to confront his own prejudices. Judge Patricia Hamilton leaned forward in her chair, her legal mind already cataloging the binding nature of a public promise made before so many witnesses. "Now hold on," William began, his voice hoarse with shock. "I obviously didn't know. I mean, if she's actually a trained dancer, then the whole premise—" "The premise," interrupted Dr. James Morrison, stepping forward with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to delivering difficult truths, "was that you judged this woman's worth based on her uniform rather than her character. The fact that she possesses extraordinary talent only makes your assumptions more reprehensible, not less binding." Emma had moved even closer to Serena, seemingly oblivious to the social protocols that should have kept the daughter of Boston's elite at a respectful distance from the help. Her heart was still racing, but now she felt an inexplicable connection to this woman who had just transformed pain into beauty, with nothing but the movement of her body. "What's your name?" Emma asked, her voice soft but clear enough for the nearby tables to hear. "Serena Washington," came the reply, and something in the way she spoke her own name carried dignity that no uniform could diminish. "Serena," Emma repeated, as if testing how the syllables felt in her mouth. "That's a beautiful name, musical, like your dancing." The simple exchange between the 16-year-old girl and the 42-year-old woman seemed to highlight the generational divide in the ballroom. Emma, raised in privilege but not yet hardened by it, could see past external circumstances to recognize genuine artistry. Her father, molded by decades of social conditioning and unconscious bias, struggled to reconcile what he had assumed with what he had witnessed. Mrs. Whitman's walking cane tapped against the marble floor as she approached the center of the ballroom, her elderly frame moving with surprising determination. The assembled guests watched with growing fascination as Boston's most formidable social arbiter prepared to render judgment on one of their own. "William Montgomery," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the vast space. "I have known your family for 40 years. I watched your father build his empire on principles of honor and integrity. I attended your wedding to Catherine, and I held your daughter when she was born. In all that time, I have never seen you behave with such cruelty toward someone who has done nothing to deserve it." The indictment hung in the air like incense, heavy and inescapable. William's face flushed red, then pale, as he realized that his social standing, the very foundation of his identity, was crumbling before his eyes. The woman he had dismissed as beneath his notice had not only proven her worth, but had exposed his own fundamental lack of character. "Furthermore," Mrs. Whitman continued, her cane tapping for emphasis, "I must confess that this entire incident began because of my carelessness. My walking cane caused Miss Washington to fall. Rather than accept responsibility for my mistake, I remained silent while you humiliated an innocent woman for an accident I caused." The confession sent another wave of murmurs through the crowd. Senator Hayes rubbed his temples, already calculating the political implications of being associated with such a public display of prejudice. Judge Hamilton made notes on her auction program, her legal instincts recording details that might become relevant if this confrontation had lasting consequences. Emma's reaction was the most profound. The revelation that an elderly woman's mistake had set her father's cruelty in motion seemed to crystallize something in her young mind about the nature of justice and responsibility. She looked at Serena with even greater admiration, understanding now that the woman had been blamed for something beyond her control. "Miss Washington," Emma said, her voice growing stronger, "I want to apologize for my father's behavior. What he said about you, about people like you, it's wrong. It's cruel and it's wrong. The apology from a 16-year-old girl seemed to carry more moral weight than anything the adults in the room had managed to produce. Serena looked down at Emma with something approaching maternal tenderness, seeing in the girl's face a compassion that transcended the barriers her father's world had constructed. "Thank you, sweetheart," Serena said softly. "But you're not responsible for your father's choices. Each person must answer for their own actions." William felt the ground shifting beneath his feet as he realized that his daughter, his precious Emma, the center of his universe since his wife's death, was aligning herself with the woman he had tried to destroy. The promise he had made in cruel jest was becoming a referendum on his character, witnessed by everyone who mattered in his professional and social world. Dr. Morrison had been observing Emma's unusual behavior with growing interest. The girl's intense emotional response to Serena's dancing, combined with her rapid heartbeat and apparent sense of connection to the woman, struck him as more than simple artistic appreciation. As a cardiologist specializing in transplant patients, he had seen enough unusual post-surgical responses to recognize when something deeper might be at work. "Emma," he said quietly, moving closer to his young patient, "how long have you been having these heart palpitations?" "Since the music started," she replied, never taking her eyes off Serena. "But they don't hurt, Dr. Morrison. They feel like recognition. Like my heart knows something my mind doesn't." The comment sent a chill through the cardiologist's professional composure. Emma's heart had come from a teenage donor 2 years earlier, a young man who had died in a car accident. The family had requested anonymity, as was common in such cases, but Dr. Morrison suddenly found himself wondering about the story behind Emma's transplant and whether there might be connections he had never considered. Serena had been listening to the exchange between Emma and her doctor with growing fascination. Something about the girl's response to her dancing, the way she seemed to understand the emotional content of the performance on an almost cellular level, stirred memories of her own son's love for tango music and dance. "Emma," Serena said gently, "may I ask when you had your heart surgery?" 2 years ago, Emma replied. "March 15th. Dr. Morrison says I'm one of his greatest success stories." The date hit Serena like a physical blow. March 15th was burned into her memory as the day her son, Marcus Jr., had died, the day she had signed the papers to donate his organs so that other families might not have to endure the loss that was destroying her world. The coincidence seemed too profound to dismiss, but the implications were almost too overwhelming to contemplate. Dr. Morrison noticed the change in Serena's expression immediately. As someone trained to observe subtle shifts in his patient's conditions, he could see that something significant had just occurred. The woman's face had gone pale, her breathing shallow, as if she had received shocking news. The ballroom remained suspended in anticipation, 400 guests waiting to see how this unprecedented confrontation would resolve itself. William Montgomery stood trapped by his own words, his social position, and the growing realization that he had revealed himself to be exactly the kind of person he had always claimed to despise. His promise hung over the gathering like a sword, waiting to fall. 6 months had passed since that fateful evening at the Ritz-Carlton, and the changes rippled through Boston society like aftershocks from an earthquake. The video of Serena's dance performance had gone viral within hours, shared across social media platforms with captions ranging from "Millionaire humiliates poor woman gets schooled" to "the most beautiful revenge ever filmed." But for those who had been present that night, the real transformation was far more complex and painful than any viral moment could capture. William Montgomery had kept his word, though not in the way anyone expected. Rather than a wedding ceremony, he had offered Serena a position as cultural director of the newly established Marcus Jr. Memorial Foundation, a gesture that acknowledged both her son's sacrifice and her own dignity. The foundation, funded with $20 million from William's personal fortune, provided scholarships, cultural programs, and support services for families facing medical crises. Serena had accepted the position with characteristic grace, though not without conditions. The foundation would be truly independent, with its own board of directors drawn from the communities it served. William would provide funding and resources, but the decisions about how to honor her son's memory would remain hers. The salary, $120,000 annually, represented financial security she had never imagined, but it came with the weight of representing something larger than herself. Emma Montgomery had become the foundation's most passionate advocate, despite her father's initial discomfort with her involvement. The teenager threw herself into volunteer work with the intensity that only the young could sustain, organizing benefit concerts and fundraising drives with her private school classmates. Her health had remained stable since that night, though Dr. Morrison continued to monitor her unusual emotional responses to certain situations. The relationship between Serena and William remained complex, built on mutual respect rather than romantic attachment. They worked together with professional efficiency, but both understood that the public promise made in anger could not be the foundation for genuine partnership. William had begun therapy to confront his unconscious biases, a process that proved far more difficult than writing checks for charitable causes. Mrs. Eleanor Whitman had become an unlikely ally, using her considerable social influence to support the foundation's work. The guilt over her role in the original incident had motivated her to examine her own assumptions about class and dignity. At 78, she discovered that learning humility was more challenging than she had anticipated, but perhaps more necessary than any lesson she had absorbed in her privileged lifetime. The ballroom at the Ritz-Carlton had been renamed the Marcus Jr. Washington Memorial Hall, a gesture that surprised everyone, including Serena. The hotel's management, recognizing both the publicity value and the genuine significance of what had occurred there, had commissioned a bronze plaque commemorating the evening when artistry transcended prejudice and dignity prevailed over cruelty. But beneath the public accolades and charitable gestures, deeper currents of change were flowing through the lives of everyone involved. Emma had been experiencing dreams that Dr. Morrison found increasingly difficult to explain through conventional medical understanding. She dreamed of dancing, of movements she had never learned, of a young man whose face she never quite remembered upon waking, but whose presence felt familiar and comforting. "Dr. Morrison," Emma said during one of her regular checkups, "do you believe that hearts can remember things the mind never learned?" The question haunted the cardiologist more than he cared to admit. Emma's transplant had been textbook perfect, no rejection issues, excellent cardiac function, complete integration of the donor organ, but her behavioral changes since that night at the charity gala suggested connections that medical science struggled to explain. She had enrolled in dance classes, showing an inexplicable aptitude for tango that her instructor described as intuitive mastery. Serena had been watching these developments with fascination and growing suspicion. Emma's natural grace, her instinctive understanding of complex dance movements, and most of all, her emotional response to tango music reminded Serena powerfully of her son, Marcus Jr. The boy had been dancing since he could walk, moving to rhythms that seemed to flow through his very bloodstream. The coincidence of dates, Emma's transplant surgery occurring on the exact day of Marcus Jr.'s death, was too precise to dismiss. Serena had never asked about her son's organ recipients, understanding that such information was typically kept confidential. But the growing evidence of connection between Emma and her deceased son created an emotional tension that she found increasingly difficult to bear. Dr. Morrison had been conducting his own quiet investigation, reviewing medical records and transplant protocols with the discretion that patient confidentiality required. What he discovered confirmed his growing suspicions while raising ethical questions that kept him awake at night. Emma's donor had indeed been a 17-year-old African-American male who had died in a car accident on March 15th. The statistical probability of coincidence was astronomically small. William Montgomery remained oblivious to these undercurrents, focused instead on managing the public relations aspects of his transformation from villain to philanthropist. The business community had watched his journey with fascination and skepticism, unsure whether his change of heart represented genuine growth or calculated damage control. His company's stock price had initially suffered from the negative publicity, but the foundation's work was gradually rebuilding his reputation. The financial commitment to the foundation had required William to examine his own relationship with wealth and privilege. $20 million represented a significant but not devastating loss for someone of his resources, yet the psychological impact of redirecting money from personal accumulation to community benefit proved more transformative than he had anticipated. For the first time in his adult life, he was measuring success by metrics other than profit margins and social status. Serena's work with the foundation had reconnected her with communities she had been forced to leave behind during her years of financial struggle. The 3 jobs that had barely kept her family afloat were now just memories, replaced by meaningful work that honored her son's sacrifice while providing real support to families facing similar tragedies. But the emotional toll of being constantly reminded of Marcus Jr.'s death through Emma's presence was becoming unbearable. The breaking point came during the Foundation's first anniversary celebration, held once again in the Marcus Jr. Washington Memorial Hall. Emma had prepared a dance performance in honor of the Foundation's work, choosing Por una cabeza, the same tango that had changed everything 12 months earlier. As she moved across the marble floor where her father had once tried to humiliate Serena, her movements displayed not just technical skill but emotional depth that seemed impossible for someone who had been dancing for less than a year. Serena watched from the audience with tears streaming down her face, seeing in Emma's performance echoes of her son's natural grace and intuitive understanding of the music's emotional landscape. The girl's body told stories she had never lived, expressed feelings she had never experienced, connected with rhythms that seemed to emanate from cellular memory rather than conscious learning. Dr. Morrison observed both women during the performance, noting Serena's visible distress and Emma's almost trance-like state of concentration. The medical professional in him wanted to document what he was witnessing, to understand the mechanisms that might explain such extraordinary post-transplant behavioral changes. But the human being in him recognized that he was watching something that transcended clinical explanation, a connection between donor and recipient that challenged everything he thought he understood about the boundaries between one life and another. As Emma's performance reached its climax, she suddenly stopped mid-movement, her hand flying to her chest where her transplanted heart was beating with unusual intensity. Her eyes found Serena's across the crowded ballroom, and in that moment, both women felt a recognition that neither could rationally explain, but neither could deny. The audience, unaware of the deeper drama unfolding before them, applauded enthusiastically as Emma completed her dance with tears streaming down her face. But Serena and Dr. Morrison understood that they had just witnessed something that would force all of them to confront questions about the nature of identity, memory, and the mysterious connections that bind human hearts across the boundaries of life and death. The Foundation celebration continued around them, but the 3 individuals most affected by Marcus Jr.'s sacrifice knew that their lives were about to change once again, in ways that none of them were prepared to anticipate. The revelation came not through dramatic confrontation, but through a manila folder placed quietly on Dr. Morrison's desk 3 weeks after the anniversary celebration. The hospital's ethics committee had been reviewing unusual post-transplant cases, and Emma Montgomery's file had raised questions that could no longer be ignored. The behavioral changes, the inexplicable dance abilities, the emotional responses that seemed to transcend normal psychological adjustment, all of it pointed toward a connection that medical protocol had been designed to prevent. Dr. Morrison sat alone in his office at Massachusetts General Hospital, the folder open before him like evidence of a crime he had unwittingly committed. The donor information, sealed for 2 years under standard confidentiality protocols, revealed what he had already suspected. Emma's heart had come from Marcus Jr. Washington, Serena's 17-year-old son, who had died in a car accident on March 15th. The statistical impossibility of the coincidence was now undeniable fact. The ethical implications crashed over him in waves. Serena had been working closely with Emma for months, watching the girl exhibit behaviors and talents that mirrored her dead son's abilities, never knowing that Marcus Jr.'s heart was beating in the chest of William Montgomery's daughter. The family that had humiliated her in public had been unknowingly sustained by her greatest sacrifice. Meanwhile, Emma had been experiencing what she could only describe as cellular memories, fragments of experiences that belonged to someone else. She dreamed of neighborhoods she had never visited, remembered the taste of food she had never eaten, and felt homesick for a mother's embrace that wasn't her father's. The dance abilities that had emerged so naturally now made terrifying sense. She hadn't learned to tango, she had remembered it. At the Montgomery estate in Beacon Hill, Emma sat in her room surrounded by dance videos and medical journals, trying to understand what was happening to her. The research she had conducted in secret revealed case studies of transplant recipients who claimed to inherit memories, preferences, and abilities from their donors. The scientific community remained divided on whether such phenomena represented genuine cellular memory or psychological projection, but Emma no longer cared about academic debates. She knew what she was experiencing was real. The most disturbing revelation had come the previous evening. While organizing her father's study, she had found a newspaper clipping about the car accident that had killed a teenage boy on March 15th, the same date as her surgery. Marcus Jr., Washington 17, honor student and dance enthusiast, had been pronounced dead at 11:47 p.m. Emma's surgery had begun at 2:30 a.m. the following morning. The mathematical precision of the timing felt like destiny or curse, depending on her mood. Serena was facing her own crisis of faith and understanding. The foundation work had forced her to relive Marcus Jr.'s death daily, memorializing his sacrifice while watching his donated heart sustain the life of a girl whose father had tried to destroy her dignity. The irony was so profound it felt like divine intervention or cosmic cruelty. Her son's final act of generosity had created an obligation to forgive that she wasn't certain she possessed the strength to fulfill. The breaking point came during a routine foundation board meeting. Emma had been presenting her proposal for a youth dance program when she suddenly stopped mid-sentence, her hand flying to her chest. The familiar rapid heartbeat had returned, but this time accompanied by what she could only describe as emotional flooding. Grief, love, and longing that weren't her own crashed over her consciousness like a tsunami. "I can't do this anymore," Emma gasped, tears streaming down her face. "I know who you are. I know what happened, and I can't pretend anymore." The room fell silent as board members exchanged confused glances. Serena rose from her chair with growing alarm, recognizing in Emma's distress something that transcended teenage dramatics. This was the grief of someone who had lost everything, filtered through the heart of someone who had gained life itself. Dr. Morrison, who had been attending the meeting to discuss medical support services, made the decision that would change everything. "Emma," he said quietly, "I think it's time we talked about your donor." The words hung in the air like a confession. Medical ethics prohibited such revelations. But the situation had moved beyond standard protocols into territory that no textbook had prepared him to navigate. Serena's face went pale as the implications crashed over her, while William Montgomery looked between his daughter and the woman who had become an unlikely partner in his journey toward redemption. "Marcus Jr. Washington," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's whose heart I have, isn't it? That's why I can dance like he did. That's why I dream about his mother's hands braiding hair I've never had. That's why I feel homesick for Sunday dinners in a house I've never seen." Serena's carefully maintained composure crumbled entirely. 2 years of grief, guilt, and forced resilience collapsed as she faced the impossible reality that her son's heart was beating in the chest of the privileged girl whose father had tried to humiliate her. The donation that was supposed to bring meaning to Marcus Jr.'s death had instead created a connection too complex and painful to bear. "You have my baby's heart," Serena whispered, her voice breaking. "All this time I've been watching you live with his heart, and I didn't know whether to be grateful or furious." William Montgomery sat frozen, finally understanding the full scope of the web that connected their families. His daughter's life had been saved by the son of the woman he had publicly degraded. Every breath Emma took, every beat of her heart, was a testament to the generosity of people he had dismissed as beneath his notice. The mathematical precision of the irony felt like divine retribution for sins he was only beginning to acknowledge. Dr. Morrison watched the three of them process the revelation, understanding that he had just violated fundamental medical ethics while simultaneously fulfilling a moral obligation that transcended professional protocols. Emma needed to understand her connection to Marcus Jr. Serena deserved to know that her son's sacrifice had saved the daughter of both her tormentor and her eventual partner. And William needed to confront the full implications of the prejudices that had nearly destroyed lives that were intimately connected to his own. The silence stretched until Emma broke it with a question that cut to the heart of everything. "Mrs. Washington, do you hate me for having what should have been his?" The question revealed the depth of guilt that had been consuming the teenager since her suspicions had crystallized into certainty. She carried not just Marcus Jr.'s heart, but the weight of survivor's guilt compounded by the knowledge that her family's privilege had come at the expense of dignity for the very people who had made her survival possible. Serena looked at the girl who carried her son's heart and saw not the privileged daughter of her former tormentor, but a child struggling to understand forces beyond her control. Emma's face, streaked with tears and twisted with genuine anguish, reminded her powerfully of Marcus Jr. during his final days when he had worried more about the family he was leaving behind than the life he was losing. "No, baby," Serena said, crossing the room to pull Emma into an embrace that felt like coming home to both of them. "I could never hate you for living. That's what he wanted, for his heart to keep beating, for someone to have the life he couldn't finish." William Montgomery watched his daughter find comfort in the arms of the woman he had wronged, understanding that their family's salvation had literally come through the generosity of people he had considered expendable. The foundation, the charity work, the public gestures of redemption, all of it paled beside the simple fact that his daughter's continued existence depended on the grace of those he had tried to diminish. Dr. Morrison documented what he was witnessing with the clinical detachment required by his profession, but privately marveled at the complexity of connections that medical science could catalog but never fully explain. Emma's post-transplant behavioral changes weren't just psychological adjustment or wishful thinking. They represented a genuine cellular inheritance that challenged everything the medical establishment thought it understood about the boundaries between one life and another. As Serena held Emma close, feeling Marcus Jr.'s heart beating strong and steady against her cheek, she whispered the words that would begin their real healing. "He's still here, sweetheart. He's still taking care of people, just like he always did. The revelation that should have destroyed their fragile family bonds instead transformed them into something deeper and more complex than blood relationships or legal obligations. They were connected now by the most intimate of transplants, not just of organs but of love, sacrifice, and the mysterious ways that grief could become grace when filtered through forgiveness. 2 years had passed since the night everything changed, and the Marcus Jr. Washington Memorial Hall buzzed with an energy that transcended its marble walls and crystal chandeliers. The annual Foundation Gala had become Boston's most anticipated charity event, not for its exclusivity, but for its radical inclusivity. Tonight, former hotel staff sat beside Fortune 500 executives. Single mothers from Roxbury shared tables with Beacon Hill socialites, and the dance floor welcomed everyone regardless of their designer labels or lack thereof. Serena Washington Montgomery stood at the edge of the ballroom, watching her blended family with a mixture of pride and wonder that still surprised her after 18 months of marriage. The hyphenated name had been Emma's suggestion, a way to honor both the family that had raised her and the family whose heart kept her alive. At 44, Serena had discovered that love could indeed come twice in a lifetime, though it looked nothing like the fairy tales she had once believed. William moved through the crowd with the confidence of a man who had learned to measure his worth by different standards. The therapy sessions had been brutal, forcing him to confront generations of inherited prejudice that had shaped his worldview without his conscious awareness. Dr. Patricia Caldwell had made it clear that good intentions couldn't erase the damage of unconscious bias, that real change required the painful work of examining every assumption he had ever made about race, class, and human worth. Emma, now 18 and a freshman at Harvard studying social work, had become the Foundation's most effective advocate. Her story, the privileged girl whose life was saved by the heart of a boy from the other side of Boston's racial divide, had captured national attention. She spoke at conferences about organ donation, cellular memory, and the ways that death could become the foundation for unexpected life. The dreams of Marcus Jr. had never faded, but she had learned to welcome them as gifts rather than haunting mysteries. Tonight marked the 3rd anniversary of that first humiliating encounter, and the transformation was evident in every detail. The waitstaff were Foundation employees earning living wages with full benefits. The auction items included scholarships, cultural programs, and direct support for families facing medical crises. Most importantly, the evening's entertainment would feature performances by young people from the Foundation's programs, their talents nurtured rather than dismissed. Dr. Morrison had been documenting Emma's case for a medical journal, part of groundbreaking research into post-transplant personality changes that challenged conventional understanding of organ donation. The scientific community remained divided, but Emma's experience had opened conversations about the mysterious connections between donors and recipients that went far beyond simple tissue compatibility. Mrs. Montgomery, called Keisha Williams, a 17-year-old dancer from Dorchester whose college tuition was fully funded by the Foundation. "Are you ready for tonight's surprise?" Serena smiled at the title she was still learning to embrace. Marriage to William had required negotiations that would have impressed international diplomats. She kept her independence, her voice, and her authority over the Foundation's direction. He provided resources and support without expecting gratitude or subservience. It wasn't the romance of her youth, but it was partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. The surprise was Emma's senior project, a multimedia presentation combining dance, spoken word, and video testimonials from organ donor families and recipients. She had spent months interviewing families across the country, documenting stories of loss transformed into life, grief converted into grace. The centerpiece was a tango performance she had choreographed herself, dancing with a holographic projection of Marcus Jr., created from home videos Serena had provided. William approached with Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, now 81 and serving as the foundation's board chair. Her transformation had been as remarkable as anyone's. The sharp-tongued society matron discovering that her greatest legacy lay not in charitable donations, but in admitting her mistakes and working to correct them. The walking cane that had caused the original accident now served as a reminder that small actions could have profound consequences. The mayor's office called, William reported. They want to rename the street where Marcus Jr. lived, Marcus Jr. Washington Boulevard will run from Roxbury to downtown, connecting the communities that his heart literally bridges. Serena felt tears prick her eyes. The boy who had worried about being forgotten was being memorialized in ways that would ensure his sacrifice remained visible for generations. Streets could be renamed, but the real monument to his life was beating in Emma's chest, pumping blood that carried both his DNA and his capacity for love. The evening's program began with a video montage of foundation success stories. Maria Santos, whose daughter had received a kidney transplant, now managed the foundation's family support services. James Patterson, a former gang member who had found purpose in peer counseling, was completing his master's degree in social work. 12 families had been kept in their homes through emergency assistance, 43 students had received full college scholarships, and hundreds of people had found employment through the Foundation's job training programs. Emma took the stage wearing a simple black dress that echoed the uniform her stepmother had worn that first night. The parallel was intentional, a reminder that dignity resided in the person, not the clothing. She spoke without notes, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived the complexities she described. 3 years ago, my father tried to humiliate a woman whose son's heart was already beating in my chest, she began. He didn't know that the person he was trying to diminish had given our family the greatest gift imaginable. He didn't understand that the woman serving champagne was actually an artist whose grace would teach him everything he needed to know about true refinement. The audience listened with the respectful attention reserved for profound testimony. Emma's speech had been crafted to avoid melodrama while acknowledging the genuine miracle of their family's formation. She spoke about cellular memory not as mysticism, but as love made manifest in the continuation of life, about forgiveness as a choice rather than an expectation, about the ways that hatred could be transformed into healing when people chose courage over comfort. My brother, Marcus Jr., because that's how I think of him now, died believing that people could change, that love was stronger than prejudice, that his death could somehow make life better for others. Tonight, I want to share what I've learned from carrying his heart, that he was right about all of it. The tango that followed was unlike anything the ballroom had ever witnessed. Emma danced alone, but not lonely, her movements suggesting the invisible presence of the boy whose cellular memory had taught her to find rhythm in grief. The holographic projection, when it appeared, didn't attempt to recreate Marcus Jr., so much as honor his memory through the movement of light and shadow that seemed to dance alongside his sister by transplant. Serena watched from the audience, William's hand warm in hers, and felt the peace that comes from understanding that some stories are too large for human planning. 3 years ago, she had been on her knees picking up broken glass while 400 people judged her worth by her uniform. Tonight, she stood as the head of a foundation that had transformed dozens of lives, married to a man who had learned to see past his own prejudices, watching her son's heart sustain the life of a girl who had become her daughter in every way that mattered. The tango reached its crescendo, and Emma extended her arms toward heaven, as if reaching for the brother she had never met but would always carry. The applause that followed felt like prayer, like gratitude made audible, like the sound of hearts learning to beat in rhythm with grace. When the evening ended, three families went home together: the Washingtons, the Montgomerys, and the new family they had created from the ruins of prejudice and the foundation of forgiveness. Dear friends, as we navigate our golden years, many of us carry the weight of choices we wish we could unmake. Words spoken in anger, opportunities for kindness we let slip by, bridges we burned in moments of pride. This story of Serena and William reminds us that it's never too late for transformation. At 68, Mrs. Eleanor Whitman chose accountability over comfort, admitting her mistake and working to repair the damage. William Montgomery, at 48, faced the painful truth about his inherited prejudices and chose growth over ego. Their journey shows us that real happiness in our later years doesn't come from protecting our image or justifying our past mistakes. It comes from the courage to say, "I was wrong," and the determination to do better. The deepest joy emerges when we stop defending who we used to be and start becoming who we're meant to be. Serena's grace and forgiveness, Emma's wisdom beyond her years, and the healing that bloomed from tragedy remind us that our greatest legacy isn't what we accumulated, but how we chose to love despite being hurt. Redemption stories don't end at 65. Sometimes they're just beginning. What past relationship in your life would benefit from your courage to make the first move toward healing? Have you ever discovered that someone you initially disliked or dismissed actually had more to offer than you realized? Share your thoughts below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.